on the slides. Just while that's being got ready, let me just say that with only 10 minutes, I've decided that I'll try and leave you with a few messages. The first message I want to leave you with is that I think the demise of the traditional utility business model is going to be much sooner than people think. I think from a regulatory and government policy perspective, there is insufficient thought being given to how that might be for the future, because it's thought about very much purely in gas and electricity terms, but I think it needs to embrace things like transportation as well. We've heard a lot about the electric car. That's fine if it's got a battery, but if it's being driven by hydrogen, I think the opportunities are different. So I want to say something about the change of the utility business model. I've got a few observations about the controlling mind. The controlling mind in all the energy space now is increasingly fragmented because of unbundling. And I think we could learn quite a bit ourselves in the UK from what has happened. And I think the other message I want to leave people with is about affordability and how all the changes that are taking place is going to be paid for. Well, the policy drivers at the moment are, as we all know, laid down by government, and it's the regulator's job to implement them. And of course, since the government in the UK has declared it wishes to cut its carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, that's only going to come about if we do something serious with a lot of things in energy. And I think the government has been pretty successful in getting investment into low carbon energy. The implications of doing some of that, though, will be different from what was originally anticipated. And when we look at the investment that's gone in, there's something like £42 billion has been invested in low carbon technology since 2010. And the impact of that has been quite profound. And I'm going to touch a little bit on that. Why do we need so much investment in our generating capacity? The winter peak demand for electricity in the UK is around 62 gigawatts on a cold winter's day. We're going to be closing down around 20 gigawatts of capacity before 2020, such as old coal and old oil, and of course replacing it with huge amounts of renewable energy, because the timing of it is it's not consistent and intermittent, has brought about a whole raft of issues. Now, in terms of the funding of low carbon technology such as wind, PV, and things like that, people talk about subsidy. And there are huge subsidies going into it. But whereas some subsidies from some parts of the world, subsidy means government money, in the UK these are predominantly all funded by levies on consumers' bills. And just to bring that into focus for a moment, we have in the UK currently about £4 billion a year in levies being added to consumers' bills. Those levies are on electricity bills, and that figure is going to rise. That figure will rise to around £7 to £8 billion a year. That's to fund things like offshore wind. Now, at the moment, the market, the wholesale price for energy in the UK is about £45 a megawatt hour. Offshore wind has an agreed strike price of around £118 a megawatt hour. And some of you will be familiar with the price that was recently agreed for new nuclear, which is coming in at around £92.50 per megawatt hour for the next 30 years and index linked. And as the price of fossil fuel falls, so the subsidy required to get to £92.50 increases. So we see this subsidy levied on consumers' bills increasing to around £9 billion per annum by 2020. With the need for new generation capacity drives the whole issue about energy security, and there has been a number of significant further interventions into the marketplace in order to try and bring on the necessary capacity to meet demand. Along the way, a lot of lessons are being learnt since we've embarked upon this programme of new low-carbon technology, the capacity auction market. All of those things have all had significant effects on the typical utility in the UK. The growth of renewables has been at an unprecedented rate in certain parts of the United Kingdom. And this is why I think we're going to see such a dramatic change in the utility business model as we currently know it. And I hope you can all hear me. I'm not sure what the noise is outside. But if we take a look at what's actually happened to PV in the UK, I think it's the lesson of what happens when technology follows the market signal that we heard from the Minister this morning. PVs have grown at an unprecedented rate. And this graph on my right and left, the three lines that you can see, you may not be able to see the date on the bottom, but the date on the bottom right-hand side goes out to 2030. And there are two scenarios you can see in red and blue. There was the high case scenario where we'd be for penetration of PVs by 2030, and the blue line at the bottom is the low case scenario. And the green line is what actually happened, and that's where we are today. So you can see what's happened in terms of the speed by which we have reached our ambition for 2030. We actually made it by 2015. And that, of course, doesn't come without implications. This is a map that, for no reason in particular, that I've missed Scotland off the top, but what's happened, this particular map here, shows the penetration of PVs. And of course, it's dominated as we move towards the southern half of the country. Why? Because the sunshine is much better in the southern half of the country. And why is it then moving to the southwest? Well, because the sun sets in the west, and the most sunshine hours are in the southwest of England. When you look at that in terms of capacity, we have now something like 6 gigawatts of PV in the UK in an extraordinarily short space of time. And each year's PV budget for the last 3 years has been hugely exceeded from what was expected. And that's why the government then had to do something radical in terms of reducing the incentives, because perverse things were happening with the PV business model. Single consumers could make a return on investment over the 25 years for their feed-in tariff of around 10%. That 10% return on investment drove institutional investors into the market. That gave birth to the rent-a-roof market. It wasn't all bad, because the rent-a-roof went on social housing. And the payback for the tenant in the social housing was they got free electricity that was provided by the PV system. For the institutional investor, they picked up the feed-in tariff as a whole. So there was a win-win. The downside was that it was going to grossly exceed the amount of money that was available for the funding of photovoltaics. And I'm focusing on this because I think it demonstrates very clearly what's been said this morning about how technology will fund the market signal. But the implications of that do not end there, because there are further incentives, and I focus on the southwest of England as an example of what happens with other incentives and the implications. I hope you can see the numbers here, but this gives a view, well, it's not a view, it is hard data on what has happened in the southwest of England with all the different incentives for different types of distributed generation. Distributed generation is having an incredible impact along with PVs. You can see the area highlighted in red for photovoltaics in the southwest is that there's nearly 2.5 gigawatts of solar power now installed in the southwest of England. When you couple that with all small-scale CHP, which has an incentive, large CHP, which has an incentive, landfill gas, which has an incentive, we have something like nearly 4 gigawatts of installed capacity of different schemes with different incentives in the southwest of England. The maximum winter demand in the southwest of England is only 2.5 gigawatts, and during the summer it's less than 1 gigawatt. And what are the implications of all that? They're massive in terms of the local distribution electricity network and the high voltage system. When I spoke earlier about the controlling mind and the thought process that sits behind this, is it broad enough to take into consideration what is actually going on here? At the moment, you can see that there will be huge network constraints in the southwest of England. And I know I'm approaching my last couple of minutes, so I'm going to wrap up very quickly. But my point in all this, that energy is locked into the southwest because the high voltage and low voltage distribution network system cannot shift it to other parts of the country to get that electricity used in the way that it should be. But of course it has to be paid for whether it's used or not. So the customer is effectively paying twice. And the long-range solution to these type of problems is to build more and more network capacity to shift it. We have a thing in Europe called Target Model 14, which is to try and interconnect the electricity network to ensure that surplus renewable energy finds a use on the network somewhere. But in talking to my colleague sitting there who's going to be talking to us tonight at dinner, he was very clear on some of the costs and benefits you get when you look at transportation in this context. We are looking at shifting all that energy somewhere else, but we are not thinking about producing, for example, hydrogen to power transport at the point of use. Imagine the savings that could be derived by not trying to shift all that energy, but looking to do something more integrated in the way of transport. So I put that up to you as an example of how you've seen change at an enormous speed and what it's doing to the business model that sits behind it, and do we have the thought and the vision to be trying to transform what is happening by almost default to make sure we have the right business model with the right level of profitability going into the future. I realise I haven't covered all the items in my slide, but I trust that from the way that I've set them out there, you'll be able to take it away as a learning point there. There are a number of other things, and on that basis, you will have, like me, learnt an awful lot today. Thank you very much indeed.